About 55% of face-to-face communication comes from body language, from what you see, about 38% from the tone of your voice, and about 7% from the words you use.
Hello, Sales Nation, and welcome to today's episode of the Salesman Podcast. On today's show, we have Nick Boothman, and he's sharing with us how we can get people both online and offline to like us within 90 seconds or less. Sounds crazy. There's a lot to go at with this episode, and we go off on some tangents as well, which is all good because it was an absolutely entertaining show to record, and so I'm sure this comes across with entertainment value for you guys as well. Everything we talk about is available in the show notes of this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com. And with all that said, let's jump into today's show. Nick, welcome back to the Salesman Podcast.
Fantastic to be back.
I'm glad to have you on, mate. The last topic we dove into, there was clearly many rabbit holes. It dives into psychology, and we're going to do exactly the same with this episode. And we're going to dive into, and hopefully you're going to explain, I don't know if there's a process for this or whether there's lots of little elements that makes it up that are somewhat separate. But I want you to help us, essentially, to use your words, make people like us in 90 seconds or less. So where I want to start with this is, and we'll lead down these funnel of questions, but does this need to happen face-to-face? Is that the only way we can build rapport fast enough to get someone to like us within 90 seconds?
No, not at all. It can happen on the phone as well, because voice tone is the only way we can convey emotion to other people. So certainly on the phone, not through texting, because as I may or may not have pointed out last time, but I certainly do in my books, about 55% of face-to-face communication comes from body language, from what you see, about 38% from the tone of your voice, and about 7% from the words you use. Although they all have to go together, and when they all go together, you are what's called congruent. In other words, you're totally believable. We all know people, I used to have a mother-in-law who used to say, "So nice to see you, dear." It was incongruent. And so, but go figure. I mean, if it's just text, if someone texts you and says, "You drive me crazy," and there's no voice tone or no body language, you don't know whether they mean they make you angry, you're falling in love with them, they make you laugh. You have no idea because there's no voice. But on the phone, you can say to someone, "Hey, you know what? You drive me crazy." And the voice tone's in there.
For sure, it makes total sense. And we may be going totally off topic here, and you may not know this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Why is tone so important? Is this because there's a certain part of our brain that evolved to understand all this before we had language, perhaps?
Asked and answered. Yeah, absolutely. Our limbic system, our limbic brain synchronizes with the brains of others. That's why, if you see someone who's angry and yelling at you, your body goes into one state. If you see, you actually tend to synchronize with them, except when someone's angry, it's all fear-based. When someone is, laid back, we synchronize with that too from the voice tone, and you can do that with your voice. Sure, you're absolutely right. That's what it is.
Why, again, we perhaps are going off tangent here, but we'll bring it back from an evolutionary perspective. Why do we synchronize with people? Because this is essentially, it's empathy, isn't it? You can consciously do it, or you can fall into it over time, or depending on the relationship with the person. But why is it a thing? Why does that exist?
Because we naturally synchronize ourselves with the people around us. It's, we when it comes to body language, by the time we're 10 months old, we tend to have the overall movements of the people that influence us, and by the time we're 5 or 6, we hold our knives and forks the same way. It's just how we learn our people skills, how our brains develop. And there's a beautiful line in what is it? It's South Pacific by Rodgers and Hammerstein, where they talk about hate, and the song is "You have to be carefully taught." Someone has to teach you to be hateful. Not in us, we're not like that. So, getting to answer your question, we synchronize. People who get on well together. Look around a restaurant. The people who are getting on, their body language is synchronized. Probably their tone of their voice is synchronized. Not everyone. You get some people who are incapable of synchronizing, or some people who think if someone else is talking quiet, if they talk loud, it will bring their volume up. No, it won't do that. So we synchronize. We sit the same way. We tend to nod the same way. You and I, synchronize now. Although I'm looking at the camera and can't see you. And and that's why it's awkward for some people to do what we're doing now. I'm looking at the camera. I've moved you as close as I can to the camera, but you're still 4 inches below it. So I can't respond. You're nodding now. I look down, but I can't respond to you. So we naturally, people whose natural people skills are still intact, naturally synchronize themselves, not just with body language, but with voice tone. Think of this. Most normal people would speak differently to a baby, an old person, or a police officer. They become a chameleon. To a baby, you might talk like this. You wouldn't talk to a cop like that. You'd be in big trouble. Or if you talk to Granny, come on, Granny, it's over there. Sit down, darling. You'll be okay. You wouldn't talk to a cop like that either. So we just have this ability to synchronize with those around us. But some people can't do it.
Why can't some people do this? And I guess there's two questions here of different depths of, I know, and you can tell us a little bit about this, perhaps, of there's, the clinical definitions of psychopaths and sociopaths and people like this that have, things don't work. I don't want to say things don't work as they should, but things work differently perhaps in their brains to the quote unquote average individual. But then if it's a learned skill as well, is there an element of this that if someone is socially awkward, if they find it hard or they come across incongruent, they come across a bit weird, might be one way of describing it, is that because they just haven't learnt it?
Well, interestingly enough, my first book, How to Make People Like You in 90 Seconds or Less, is very highly regarded by the Asperger's Society and with groups of kids that have Asperger's, because Asperger's is essentially social blindness. You can't pick up on feedback from somebody else. You've no idea what you can't interpret what they're giving off. In my book, I don't say, for example, I talk about eye contact, which you need to do. But I don't say, look at somebody in the eye as an instruction. I say, just notice the color of the eyes of each person you talk to. Now, for someone with Asperger's, you've just told them something really simple. And if you want to smile, just say great to yourself 3 times as you approach, and you'll be smiling. Great, great, great. And these are really simple things, but they are what you call socially blind. You talked about psychopaths, but that is another thing altogether. There's quite an interesting book called The Wisdom of Psychopaths. And like most books that I read are how-to books, I can usually figure it out where the book's going if it's well written by the end of the first chapter, so I never read the rest. But in The Wisdom of Psychopaths, which I didn't read the rest of, essentially they took incarcerated psychopaths and tested them in comparison to great business leaders. And in every case, the great business leaders scored higher on the psychopathy scale than the incarcerated the prisoners, except in antisocial behavior. So it's things like a psychopath is brilliant at being a chameleon. They can blend in, they can flirt, they can get close to you, they can give off oodles of empathy. But they are completely. But they're great leaders, and in fact, if I'm right in this, and we are off topic, but we got an hour. Psychopaths in the early days when we were all living in caves, except as we're Brits, we were living up trees, of course, very well furnished trees. I'm joking, everybody. But the tribe was constantly under threat of invasion from the tribe round the corner, and so they had this group of people who were trained to go out and on the periphery of the tribe. And if someone was going to attack, they would just slit their throats. Okay. And in fact, there's a great series on TV a few years back called Rome, where I don't know if you ever saw it, where the central guy was a centurion or whatever he was, and he was a great guy. And during the week he was off outside slitting throats. When he got home at the weekend, the wife said, "Hey, hold the baby for 5 minutes and sweep out this," because he wasn't at work. So, but the wisdom of psychopaths is very interesting.
I interviewed someone, his name's Jim, I'll link to his book in the show notes of this episode. He is a neuroscientist, PhD, relatively famous in his field, I think, from the context of our conversation. And he was studying psychopaths. He thought it'd be a laugh to study himself. It turns out he has really high psychopathic tendencies. And it was only, he's done a great TED Talk that I'll link to in the show notes as well on this topic. But he lived his whole life he described himself as aggressive and assertive and he got what he wanted. He was a great negotiator, even though he was a research scientist. Versus the CEO or anyone of that nature, that there's a stereotype of perhaps a great negotiator tied with that. And it came as a shock to him. So I'm sure there's people in the audience listening as well who especially in the sales profession, if they've got that tendency and that tenacity, there's probably a very fine line there between being a crazy person versus just having success.
Yeah, but look, I have 5 children. I have lots of grandchildren. I know I have the touch of the psychopath. I have my inner psychopath working. I'm under no illusions. I've reinvented myself many times. It doesn't mean I'm not antisocial and I'm not cruel and mean, but I have the other characteristics, and I can tell which of my kids have it and which don't, and their friends, and I can directly relate it to their success in business. There are CEOs who will say, well, we can't fire those guys. It's too cruel for them. Yeah. We'll try and find something else to do. And the company fails. A CEO with enough psychopaths will say, it's business. I'm sorry, guys. You have to go. And of course, it's heartbreaking. That's all I mean by it. And I know tons of people who have failed in business. They get along. They wonder what ever happened. Well, you're too soft. And that's I don't mean it in a bad way. I mean, you're soft when you need to be firm. And so it's an interesting concept. So you can probably rate your inner psychopath on a scale of 1 to 10, and probably not tell anybody. Whatever you do, don't tell anybody like I just did.
No, for sure. I'm definitely on that scale. I think one of my great skills in business life in general is empathy. So I knew this before I'd read books about emotional intelligence, books on empathy, anything like that. I've always been able to, whether it's a friend when I was a kid or whether it's like girlfriends through high school, whatever it was, I'd be able to sit down and I'd be able to almost read their thoughts from just looking at them and diving into conversations and knowing the right things to say to have a super deep conversation super quickly. But on the reverse side of that, I am aggressive in business. I know what I want. I will go after deals and I'll be not relentless with it. Again, I've got that empathy to know if I'm annoying someone and I can pull back and readjust. But there's plenty of times when I've annoyed people because I've gone after stuff harder than what they would expect, if that makes sense. So there's an angle of this in me as well. And pulling this back to the idea of getting someone to like you in 90 seconds or less for a second, how do we balance this? Because I think there's going to be a lot of salespeople listening now who maybe, if they're old school, if they've been selling for 10, 15, 20 years, they are from the days of you pick up the phone, there's weird manipulation tactics that you can use to get through to people, to communicate on that deep level, but you are manipulating people. How do they walk, if they've been trained on this, where is the line? How do they walk the line between being they're getting the job done, but there might be loads of buyer's remorse out the other side, which clearly isn't good, and being too soft and being too likable? Because clearly there's a balance here in between.
Yeah. Wow. Well, first, I always say if I get bad service in a store, and I've really experienced it, and my friends say, oh, they should fire the guy for being like that. I said, no. They should fire the guy that hired him. All right. And I think if people are still hiring guys that go and put the arm on you and as we say, and do all this, they're just old school, and I don't know what you can do about them. New school is, my whole website right now is more or less devoted to what I call fully connected. And fully connected means you connect on 3 levels, on trust, logic, and emotion. In other words, when you're with people, they somehow inside them feel, I trust you, you make sense, and you move me. That's the essence of what I'm doing. And that's what today's great salesmen or salesmen, women, children, whatever, do. They fully connect. When you see, some people can connect on 1 of those levels, a few on 2, and the ones that connect on 3 are truly great communicators. And it seems like that's exactly how you described yourself. You have trust, you work very hard. No, but you work very hard before the show even starts, with all the stuff that goes backwards and forwards from you. This is not some fly-by-night guy. You obviously do your homework. Your logic makes sense. The things you're saying to me make sense. And essentially, these are quite emotional interviews that you do because you You try and get into the essence of people. You plop straight into their hearts and start pulling stuff out. And as we know that approximately 80% of decisions that humans make are made by their emotions, even though they think they're being rational. The stock market doesn't go up rationally; it goes up through greed, and it drops through fear. These are emotions. And getting back for a second to what you were saying about why you're empathetic, you can sense what someone's going to say. That is because you are picking up on their body language, on their voice tone, and on the words they're using. In fact, you're picking up on their voice tone and their body language to know almost what they're going to say next, because you can synchronize with them. You synchronize, you have your natural born people skills still intact.
So I want to come on to each of these, and I think this is probably a good step-by-step process to run through trust, logic, emotion within that first meeting. And that first meeting can happen over and over and over. I just want to clarify that. I'm not talking about the very first time you meet anyone, because clearly you can top up this rapport over time.
Sure.
But before that, you used a word then which intrigues me, and that is when you were describing kind of my empathy and my ability to, I'm doing inverted commas here, but sense what the other person is thinking. Should we be aiming with the whole conversation and where we're going to go from here, Nick? Should we be aiming to sense things, to have that gut feeling, or do we need to understand all of this consciously and have a step-by-step regimen of when they smile, we do this. When they shake hands and it's a limp, wet handshake, that means this and that. Is this a conscious process, or are we using our gut feeling and our senses to kind of guide us as we go along?
It's very definitely not contrived. There are people that I have somebody I'm working with now who wants to improve his conversation and become more interesting, and is almost, I spoke about the elements that go into conversation. Actually, it's quite an interesting. If we can have a 2-minute segue about what I'm talking about, this guy will help a lot of people. But he says, okay, I did this. I threw in a color. I threw in a feeling. I looked at this. I did that, and he's so preoccupied with what he's doing. It's completely unnatural. As opposed to, I gave him a word which he hadn't heard before, which is a very Brit thing. Which is, and I said to him, all my family, my wife, my children, and most of my friends are great raconteurs. They can tell. They can make it sound interesting. Getting out of their car in the parking lot and getting into the elevator. They say, "You won't believe what happened." That's what people find interesting. What we were just joshing backwards and forwards. So these sort of things take the place of, a little less formally, take the place of this contrived. Should I learn to do this? Did I look the person in the eye for 3 seconds? Did I stand up straight on my, sure, your shoes should be clean. But they take the place of that. And I call it assuming rapport. Assuming rapport is the easiest way. And in fact, it's what people do as they get older. They just assume rapport with other people. They just talk to someone as if it's their long lost cousin, or they've known them forever. Again, the Brits are brilliant at doing this. The Brit will talk to you anywhere, standing at the bus stop. Well, look at that. Can you believe what that? And you're suddenly talking. You take away all the formalities out of it. So, and I illustrated in How to Make People Like You, where I tell a story. I went into a store, a local store, which sells radios and in a kind of a shacky kind of place.
Because you can say brands, I'm not bothered.
No. They've bucked up. In fact, they've renamed themselves. They've rebranded. But the guy I'm talking to, I was trying to get something, and the guy standing in front of me on the other side of the counter, all bit, but with his one foot on a stool and his other foot on the floor, talking to me. So all I've got to look at really is his completely exposed, wide open legs, and all I want to do is get out of there. I went further down the street. And I went into I saw a picture in an art gallery I really liked, and I was standing looking at it, I sort of how you do when you look standing in front of a picture, maybe your arms folded and just looking, and sort of slightly rocking, and I became aware of somebody standing next to me, almost in the same position, and they just said, "It's nice, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah, it is nice," and boom, that was assuming rapport. Now, I wrote the book on this stuff, and it didn't look like it was phony. It was just synchronized. So there are lots of ways that the sales guys of today can synchronize, and as I just said, fully connected is trust, logic, and emotion. But the trust does come first, and you get trust from somebody by assuming rapport, opening your body language, not being scary to people.
Is this
eye contact is the big one. Eye contact says trust is in the air. No eye contact, no trust.
For sure. Well, so it's weird this, because I was just about to, and I think this will be along every step of the way. I was just about to describe when you're not using eye contact with someone, it's almost like you're feeling shady. I'm describing the physical process with a story or a narrative, and that's probably what's going on in our subconscious as we notice someone isn't giving us eye contact. Our brain is probably telling a story, or even making up a story, rightly or wrongly, about them as well. But I love this idea of assuming rapport. You mentioned something then that as we get older, this is something we do more of. I know this for a fact, that I do this now, and I didn't when I was first in medical device sales. So like 6 years ago or so, I would almost be over preparing for conversations. I'd be over worried about what the person thought of me. I'd be, nervous of saying something stupid. I'm 30, so I'm sure when I'm 40, I'll look back at myself and go, when you were 30, you were still an idiot. Maybe that doesn't change. Maybe every decade you look back at yourself and think, you were still doing silly things then. But when I look back at my kind of 23, 24, 25-year-old self, I was way more concerned about the other person. And now with a bit more life experience, I know that 99% of the time, they don't even notice, and then they don't even care. If you make a mistake and you own up to it, it's just not a big deal whatsoever. So where I'm going with this is, can we accelerate this process of being able to assume rapport? Is it just confidence? Is it understanding that people are more concerned about what you think of them versus what they think of you? Is there a way to expedite this process of just becoming more comfortable? It comes down to that, doesn't it?
Sorry, there's a lot of questions there. I'm trying to remember them all, but that is essentially how to make people like you. It's about, I say in the book. But as you get older, this stuff comes naturally and easily. So let's accelerate it. Let's get you doing now what you'll be doing in 30 years from now, which is exactly what you're saying. Every day goes by, you can figure out more stuff to say to people. You've got more opinions. You've seen more stuff. You get less nervous. You get more confident. Or, quite frankly, Scarlett, you couldn't care less. As long as you're big and nice person, of course. Someone walks in your store, you don't have to jump all over them. I don't know about you, but there's nothing worse for me than going into a store and someone saying, have a nice day, or can I help you, or swarming all over. Or the opposite, which happened to me last week. I went out looking for some shoes to walk into, and I'll tell you, I went into stores, and one or two stores the service was great. Others it was, there's the walking shoes there, head set back on, and off to the other side of the store. There is a happy medium
for sure. And most of my audience are kind of above that level of one kind of like transactional sales, so it's long-term relationship sales in the B2B space. But I think that ties in as well of when you first, and we'll come back, we're eventually going back to where we started here, Nick, but when you first meet someone, you've still got those two personas that I often find of, for example, I did this live event last week. We did a bunch of interviews live at the Revenue Summit in San Francisco, and I had it was amazing, loads of the audience came to the event to both say hello to me and to see the keynote speakers and everything else as well. But half of the people, and there wasn't really anyone in between, but half of the people came over super kind of like excited, shook my hand, wanted a selfie, were kind of a bit in my face. And at first I was a bit thrown back from it because I wasn't expecting it whatsoever. But then you had the total other side of first impressions of those people that were overly cautious. They were just like kind of hanging around, waiting for the right moment to come and say hello. And it was almost a little bit awkward at that point because I'm wondering why they're stood there staring at me. And, I'm wondering then if they're actually here to speak to me or someone else in the team that's there. So it's interesting, that kind of like dynamic between the two. And, it goes from buying a pair of shoes to meeting, podcasters that you listen to every day to, again, in my world, medical device sales, meeting surgeons. And I guess there's a happy compromise there. And where I want to go with this, Nick, is, so you're assuming rapport. So that there's a bit of trust there because you got your guard down. You're not provoking the other person to put their guard up, and you are approaching them willing for a natural, interesting conversation. How does logic come into this?
Well, okay, so trust, people have to trust you, and there are ways of doing that. I told them, look them in the eye, smile, open your body language, find common ground. The quickest way to make somebody feel trusting and comfortable is to find common ground. I mean, for you and me, how difficult can it be? We've both got British accents, so you can start there. And I call it Me Too moments, finding Me Too moments, opportunities to say Me Too. You should be able to find common ground with somebody when you through practice in about 15 to 30 seconds. And so that's a great place to go to get trust. Other ways you'll get trust is if you work for a company which has a great brand, or a company like yours, which is well known. People are going to trust you immediately because they know who you are. They've got your background. Same as with certain celebrities, they come with the trust involved. Logic, though, your logic has to make sense. What you're saying to them has to make sense. It has to have a point. If it doesn't have a point and if it doesn't make sense, then people are going to dismiss you. So that's the trust and the logic, and then the third one is the emotion. If you're selling something which makes no sense at all, people just want to get out of there because they're not stupid. Really, if someone comes in, I mean, we had someone stop by the farm here quite recently, and I was on the balcony outside my studio. This person stops, who I know reasonably well, and said, "Are you guys interested in making money?" Right, you know exactly what's coming next. Is it probably MLM or I don't know, something. So it was no trust, and the logic was ridiculous. Anyone who starts with rhetoric, an opening line that's rhetorical, forget it. And so there was nothing there. So that's the trust and the logic. It has to make sense.
So we just shook hands with someone, or we're just introducing ourselves. Which comes first, or is the emotion tied into how we portray the logic? So I don't want to dive into too deeply into how you introduce yourself and how you have an elevator pitch and things of that nature. We've covered that elsewhere on the show. I'm more interested in the nuance of this. So say you are going to do an elevator pitch. You're going to shake someone's hand, or you're going to introduce yourself, and you get your company name in there if it's a well-known company to build that trust further. Should we be unemotional and totally logical and spell everything out? Is that the first step? And then we add excitement and charisma on the back end of the kind of like first 15, 30 seconds, or does it all get tied into one thing?
No, none of that. I mean, that's just, it's just not necessary. It's just not that complicated. You when you meet somebody, you're hunting around probably for common ground. Look, where are you going to meet them? You're meeting an event, for example, the event you were at. How come you're here? How far did you come to get here, or anything? An occasional location statement. I don't know if I mentioned, but I did this on the Today Show, and I said to Meredith Vieira, 5 things that she said, okay, so I walk into a room full of strangers. How can I appear socially smarter? Which is basically the same thing. Yep. You're at a convention. How can I appear socially smarter? Number 1, wear great clothes because more people would take you seriously. They don't have to be anything spectacular, but they should be great, and your shoes should be clean or whatever. Number 2, when you're walking into a room, head for the middle of the room because you appear popular if you're in the middle of the room. Number 3, as you head for the middle of the room, walk more slowly than you would normally. Number 4, you've got to find something to say. So you have to approach people. And number 5 is starting a conversation. And how do I start a conversation with someone I don't know so I come across smart? You tack something onto the occasion or the location, in which case she said, well, what would you do right here? I said, hey, I hear New York is the most fantastic place. If I only had 4 hours, what should I see? And then it's over to you. And it's the same thing when you meet somebody, you may actually be genuinely curious. I've only got half a day at this exhibition. What do you reckon? Have you seen anything that I should actually go and see? So you get a human to human contact before you start going into what you're doing.
you've just outlined, rightly or wrongly. So I've been with my partner now for 4 years, but I think how I even met her was I've only ever had one chat up line, which was essentially because I was new to Leeds when I moved here originally. When I was going out and meeting people, it would essentially be like, "I'm new to Leeds. Are there any bars or anything that you'd recommend?" kind of thing. That would I used that. I probably used that about 200 times in the first year that I was single, that I lived here. More even, maybe 200 times a night. I've no idea. But yeah, that would give me that open. It would allow me then to be, happy, smiley, be confident in front of,
human. It's being human.
Yeah.
You don't want people who are programmed and are either in a bad mood because they're programmed. You want people who are normal. I'll tell you a very quick funny story. I occasionally have done one-on-one work with people, and a few years ago I was taken down to I charged the same as I charged for a big seminar, a big event. I was taken down to Austin, Texas. Let me shift this around a bit. I was taken down to Marina Del Rey, let's say, and to talk to a child, the 21-year-old who the parents thought had got no chance with people skills. And I really didn't have much to say because, it's pretty simple. I said, look, let's go out and we'll go out somewhere and I'll tell you how to start chatting to strangers. We went around the corner to a bar for lunch. We sat at the bar and he's sitting there and I'm sitting here. And there was a woman sitting next to me with a strange gadget on in front of her. And I said to him, okay, watch this. She was looking in the menu. I said, hi. I said, look, I've never eaten here before. Is there anything you can recommend? She sort of said, well, neither have I. Like, me too moment. Oh, wow. So tons to talk about there. But then I said, I have to ask you, what's that thing in front of you on the desk? She said, I'm Pepsi's corporate jet pilot. And I'm just waiting for the person I brought down here to buzz me, and I'll go off and I have to fly him to, I don't know where next. And the guy next to me, he said, oh my God, you're so good. Just picked up corporate's female jet pilot. But it's just by finding common ground. She had a menu. I've never eaten there before. You can do that with anybody.
For sure. And final thing I want to wrap up with this, Nick, and this is, again, the answer might be whatever flows naturally. But what should the ratio be between asking questions and listening? Clearly, you've got to ask a question to kind of get that first involvement and get the opportunity to then listen. And then you've got the opportunity to go deeper and go back and forth and build that rapport. But and the reason I'm asking you this is for the audience perspective again. So at this event, some of the people, they would be question, and it was tiring for me. It was value sucking from the conversation. You had the people who are more calibrated in the middle, and you had people on the other side who come up and be like, hey, love the podcast. And then, they were, rightly or wrongly expected me to then talk to them and ask them questions for 5 minutes. And obviously there's a nice middle ground here. But is there I'm not asking for a ratio necessarily, but how do we know whether we're going right within this bouncing back between the two?
Well, it's funny. There was somebody, I think, in California invented a table to teach conversation. And in front of each person was a red light. And if they spoke more than, if a person spoke more than 25% of the conversation, the red light went on. In other words, they're hogging the conversation and it would go off and then someone else would take over. But, first of all, I tell people, you have to get people talking and keep them talking. Okay. So how do you keep people talking? And the answer is, most people say, oh, you ask them another question. Well, no, before that, you have to give feedback, physical feedback and what I call international grunts. Just do a bit of grunting. Look like it's going in. The people that come and ask you one question about the podcast, you say, what else? Do you have anything else to say? Or how else can I help you? And you know what's really good in those situations? And I do it a lot. You spoke before about someone's talking to you and other people are hanging around and you didn't know if they wanted. I bring them all in. I say, look, don't understand that. Come, let's all talk together. We've all got the same things on our mind. And the next thing you know, this guy's meeting this guy, this guy's meeting this guy, or answering this guy's question. And then you can wander off and do it again with some other people. Because the whole idea at these events essentially is to boost the intellectual capital of who's there. In other words, to get people, even within the same company, half the people in some of these companies don't know about other people, that they've spoken to them on the phone for years, And so I guess where I'm going, my message is that this is not complicated. And you know what? I did a personal consultation for somebody this morning, and he couldn't believe the fact that I was saying, when I was a kid, when I was maybe 9 or 10, I knew this guy who lived around the corner. He was about a year older than me, and we'd go out places together. And I couldn't believe how he could talk to people. And I'm thinking, I can't do that. How can I? Where did that come from? He just said something. Where did he pull that out of the air from? Amazing magic. How can I do that? But you grow up a little bit and it starts to come out of the air. And the more you practice it, the better it goes. And now I'm teaching it.
Amazing. I've got I'll wrap up with this, but I've got a very similar kind of anecdote of that of my dad. He's better now because my mum passed away, so he's had to take over some of the reign of the conversation just naturally. But my dad is a bit shy is probably the wrong word, because he is an alpha bloke. He's confident in himself, but he's a man of fewer words. Versus my mum, she has this skill of being able to turn around to anyone, anywhere, anytime, and just being able to strike up a conversation. And as I said, she passed away last year, but that's one of my, if not the main memory I've got of her. There's countless times. There's one time when we went to Chicago a few years ago, she sat next to someone at a bus stop, just asked a question because we were totally lost. And we were edging closer and closer to the places in Chicago where we shouldn't have been. So we ended up chatting to this lady. She put us on the right bus. Where we're getting off the bus, and Mum's like, we're going to grab lunch. Do you want to come with us for lunch? And this woman doesn't know what was going on, and she very nearly ended up sitting down with us and going for a few drinks and having lunch. And I saw the kind of like two individuals and the two ways of going about it. I could see as a young child, my mum have this skill, and my dad have other skills, but less of that particular skill. And it was interesting, the yin and yang between the two of them when they would go out. So clearly, I've been thinking about this from a younger age, and I've read loads of books on psychology and self-development to learn more about it now, so I've got a better understanding. And clearly, these interviews with experts like yourself, Nick, makes total sense. But yeah, where I want to wrap up the show is...
Well, if I can, your mother was assuming rapport. That's what she just assumed.
Yeah, she saw the best. So my dad's a pessimist. My mum was an optimist. And my mum would sit down and assume that the person she's speaking to is going to have a great conversation. There's nothing dodgy going on. There's no threat, again, rightly or wrongly. Whereas my dad would be like, that person might be rude, or, he would see the negative side of things where mum would see the positive. And again, I think that sums up quite nicely that assuming reports kind of angle on things.
But it's one sec for your dad, because for anyone listening, I want to tell you, there's no such thing as shy. Nobody was born shy. It's not a human attribute. They were probably born cautious or reserved, which are extremely good things. And probably your father was cautious or reserved. But people, look, how does someone know they're shy? Somebody told them. One of my rants on stage, there's no such thing as shy except shying away from a horse or shying away from something. But people tell kids this when they're young, and you know what? They end up believing it. So your dad was probably cautious or reserved, a fantastic partner for your mother, who could assume rapport anywhere.
Mate, I love that. Shyness is a label, clearly, isn't it? And if we go back to the evolutionary side of things, that cautiousness, matched with someone who is probably more out there, it's probably, the chemistry is probably there for a reason. And with that, Nick, and thank you for that. I'll tell him that. That'll be a nice kind of conversation I'll have with him later on when I give him a call tonight. So I appreciate that, mate. And with that, Great. I've got one final question to ask everyone that comes on the show. I've asked you it before, but I'm going to ask you it again. And that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
Well, I can't remember what I said last time, but I would probably say, be brave, take risks, blame no one. And maybe that's what I said last time, because that's what I live by. For
sure. It's similar. And I think this blame no one or take total responsibility for things, I think that's so important in sales.
That's abstract. Blame no one. Blame no one. Otherwise, you'll never learn anything. I have to say, even Tony Blair, he said, look, I take full responsibility for this. Otherwise, how can I learn anything? David Cameron said, don't blame anybody else. Don't blame my dad. Don't blame the government. Blame me. Otherwise, how else can I learn from it? And I think it's not taking responsibility. It's blaming. If you blame no one, you'll end up taking responsibility. But it's putting the cart before the horse. Just blame no one and you'll be responsible.
Fair enough. Different way of looking at it. And with that, Nick, we kind of alluded to the book. I think you mentioned it. But tell us a little bit more about the book. Clearly, there's a series of them, and where we can find out more about you as well.
Well, my first book was, look at these are all the Indian versions that just came. How to Make People Like You in 90 Seconds or Less. Now in over 30 languages and almost 2 million copies sold. Then I brought out Convince Them in 90 Seconds. But if you look here, this is for the Indian subcontinent only. I just saw it, just came through the mail. How to Make People Like You is about social skills. Why is it some people can walk into a room and immediately feel comfortable with others? What are they doing? How do they do it? The book shows you. It shows you. It doesn't tell you. It shows you. Lots of stories about people. In other words, things you can do yourself, just like the guys from Asperger's. And my business book is the same thing because you can't make a living selling to your friends. It's very, very different. You can't walk away from a relationship in business without walking away from your job. And so How to Make People Like You is just like that. It just shows you chapter by chapter with fun stories how to make people like you in 90 seconds or less.
Good stuff. I'll link to all that in the show notes of this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com. Nick, thank you again for the charming conversation, mate. I appreciate the insights. I appreciate the back and forth as well. That means a lot to me that you kind of will give it back and give me your thoughts and opinions when I give mine. So I appreciate that, mate. And I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Thanks a lot. All the best.